Thank you. Hi, everyone. So I'm the last speaker of a long day, so thinking of publics, thank you for staying around. I wanted to start by trying to kind of articulate a different way of thinking how we're connected on this globe. So by thinking in the words of Donna Haraway, it matters which thoughts think thoughts, and to call for a kind of tentacular approach to thinking our current moment, for feeling, sensing, and trying, and for understanding that nobody lives everywhere, everybody lives somewhere, that nothing is connected to everything, and everything is connected to something. I also want to echo some of the speakers today and stress the importance of situating the current moment within the historical precedents that allow some to feel that they can inhabit the global, and others to remain in the category of the local. So, in a global sense, there's an uneven access to collecting opportunities, either due to the structural absence of collecting institutions, the material absence of funds, or the absence of human resources. And Lebanon is a place where these absences were and are both productive and destructive, and continue to be very much felt today. So artworks do move, and they should move, but what kinds of holes are left by the movement of artworks from one history to another? So these holes are productive terrain for artists. The artist Walid Raad his work deals with these questions head on. With the absence of an articulation of history and the absence of archives, in his ongoing work, Scratching on Things I Could Disavow, he looks at the recent emergence in the Arab world of new infrastructures in the visual arts, the race to articulate a history of Arab art, and how economic and military conflicts affect art, culture, and tradition. So what are the roles and responsibilities of a museum in our present moment, which is a moment of crisis, menaced by the swift rise of fascism in Europe and North America, or where I'm speaking from, plagued by ongoing resource wars and the legacies of occupation and colonialism. To speak of the Sursut Museum and its responsibilities and its publics, I have to speak about the context within which the museum lives. So I wanted to start here with an image of the Sursut Museum during the initial stages of its subterranean expansion. And to me, this speaks about how it was situated within the city. So it was perched precariously on thin metal legs, unsure of whether it would survive a prolonged surgical procedure, while it remained cut off from the city by the deep crevices encircling it. This is how the museum was for many years, unsure of its relevance and cut off from the very place that gives it sustenance. So the extension took 8 years. And here's a more recent picture of the museum. So all the new spaces are underground, and this is the kind of old house. So I'll give a brief introduction to the context of where we work, the context of Beirut. It's a place where you speak 3 languages and shop in 2 currencies. It's a highly stratified city where privatization, real estate development, and the erosion of the last corners of the public sphere are grave issues. And where just a 2-hour drive away, there's a bloody civil war raging, spilling 1 million people over the open borders. At the same time, and despite all of its dysfunction, the city has become a haven for people from nearby countries, Iraq, Egypt, Palestine, and of course, Syria. So the history and the future of the city of Beirut and that of the museum are intricately linked in many ways. The Sursut Museum is currently the only museum of modern and contemporary art in Beirut, and it's the only one with a public mission. We've now been open for 1 year after an 8-year renovation and expansion, and in a sense, this long absence from the cultural sphere enabled the museum to reinvent itself, to start afresh, and to begin forging new connections to place. So just to give a little history of the place, because I'm sure many of you have never heard of it probably. The building was built in 1912, 30 years before independence, by Nicolas Sursut, a member of a wealthy Ottoman family. It was bequeathed to the city of Beirut in 1952 as a museum for the art of the time. It had its heyday in the 1960s and early 1970s, stirring debate on art practices of the time, showing artists such as Salwa Rawda Sh'er and Arif al-Rayes, artists who would go on to become international names. Most notably, it created a scandal by showing predominantly abstract works in an exhibition in 1965, marking the move to abstraction and away from figuration for many local artists. But as with many things, when the Civil War started in 1975, time stopped. The museum kept the same staff throughout the war and the post-war period, and it also kept the same programming strategy. So it slowly disconnected from its context, and its funding also dried up. And here, As I mentioned, its fate is intricably bound up with that of Beirut. In the 1960s, a law was passed in which the museum would receive in perpetuity a percentage of tax on construction permits deposited in the city of Beirut. So the museum essentially lives off Beirut's reconstruction, its destruction, and its reconstruction. So it's said that there were more buildings destroyed after the war due to the construction and privatization of the city than during the war. So this direct relationship to the city's built environment is an important one for us. And here's an image of Martyrs Square, which is the kind of main public square of the city, sort of just after the war and now as it currently stands now. And also the museum is home to the original Martyrs Square statue, which was put up in the 1930s to commemorate the martyrs killed by Ottoman rule in 1916. But soon taken down after public outcry as it was unmodern, too emotional, depicting two mothers crying over their martyred sons. The sculpture was rescued from a bus depot after the war, found covered in oil. It was cleaned and now lives in our esplanade. For me, this is a symbolic marker of the museum as a public space, linking it to the history of the city and to Martyrs Square. That's the statue in our esplanade now. So the months before we opened were important ones, not because we were rushing around to get the museum open, but because the country had come to a breaking point. The streets were filled with garbage, a manifestation of accumulated corruption and greed. So we were choking in decades of corruption, mismanagement, theft of public resources, and privatization of the public sphere and public services. In a stateless state, there was no accountability, and today we continue to drown in garbage. This is the opening night of the museum on October 8th, 2015. So on the left-hand side, you have an image of Martyrs Square, where there were anti-corruption and anti-government protests going on. And at the same time, on the right, you have an image of the reopening of Beirut's Museum for Modern and Contemporary Art. So it was a strange moment, but actually perhaps it's now the new normal. So what was important to me was that people were actually going to the protest and then coming to the museum, sort of soaked and dripping in water from the water cannons. So that for me was a really important marker of how the museum was kind of, how important it was really for the public in the city. So the slow violence of corruption, of the toxic waste, of the erosion of public sphere, these are all one and the same issues. And I wanted to talk about a recent project, recent exhibition and larger project at the Citizenship Museum. Let's talk about the weather, art and ecology in a time of crisis. So this exhibition brought together 18 artists with 7 new commissions. The exhibition was curated together with Paris-based curator Natasha Patricine Bachelet. I had wanted to put together this exhibition upon my arrival to the museum in 2015, before the garbage crisis happened. So the violence of climate change is one of the most urgent issues of our time. Though regionally, it was not high on the agenda. As most people would say, we have more urgent things to worry about, like the wars raging next door, displaced people, and real political change. But actually, all of these are linked deeply to ecological concerns. With the garbage crisis, this became all the more urgent. So it was important to start to unpick these entanglements, to think about the local implications of this truly global crisis, to create affinities between struggles in Lebanon and elsewhere. So I'm going to talk through a kind of selection of themes that anchored the exhibition. So the theme of petro-histories and petro-cultures. So this theme was a proposition to read our history as the history of the accumulation, consumption, and production of energy. Petroleum is a substance that has deeply changed the region, in one generation, shifting how people live their lives and organize politically. Here you see the work of Munira al-Qadiri, who's a Kuwaiti artist living in Lebanon. Her work explores the social and political shifts in Kuwait, brought about by the changeover from a craft-based economy to a petro-economy. In this particular work, she's exploring the formal link between petroleum and pearls. Pearl export was an important part of the Kuwaiti economy, where pearl diving in the sea being important cultural signifiers. So she discovered a formal link between oils and pearls, that they're on opposite ends of the same color spectrum, on the dichroic color spectrum. So her work was a series of sculptures based on deep-sea oil drills. The legacies of colonialism and the continuing exploitation of resources. This was explored here through the work of Sami Balogi, whose large-scale photographs of rare earth mineral mines in the Congo speak to the continuing colonial relationship materialized in the control over resources and labor. And here's an image of the work of Claire Pentecost titled Amor Fati, which was a direct question, can we love the fate that we have created for ourselves? So Claire used materials from around the city of Beirut, collecting water from the sea, from the Beirut River, which is now used as a sewage and chemical dump, and from the tap, which is pretty much the same thing. She worked with an environmental engineer who created these tiles made of paper, and the image you see is that, well, you can barely see it, but it's an image of a cycloblatus, which is a fossilized life form that was living in the shallow seas of Lebanon and Syria, and whose fossilized remains we continue to live off of. So the work is a kind of monument to extinction and the slow and steady slide towards the sixth mass extinction. So corruption and contamination. It was important for the exhibition to historicize the current crisis within the recent history of the state of Lebanon. So here you see the work of artist Jessica Khazri, or the Society of Fault Witnesses. The work is titled Waste Eats Your Histories, and it traces the recent history of toxic waste dumping in Lebanon through the archive of scientist Pierre Malichev. In the 1980s, as Lebanese militia, in collusion with the Italian mafia, imported tons of toxic waste from Italy, burying and dumping it around Lebanon. A group of scientists were hired to investigate this and other waste scandals. Among these were the ecotoxicologist Pierre Malichev, whose photographic archive the artist came across and is now activating. Pierre Malichev took thousands of photos of flowers and garbage, documenting sites around the country where waste was being illegally dumped and where the ecosystems were being poisoned, contaminated. But him, along with the 4 other scientists, were soon put in prison under charges of being false witnesses. So they were jailed by the very same government that hired them, of fabricating evidence, a charge brought against them to the collusion of the state and the militias. So this was an important work for the exhibition as it generated much discussion around this incident whose history has been suppressed, drawing a straight line from the wartime decimation and post-war decimation of public infrastructure and the present-day crisis. So here are some images from the artist's archive, from Pierre Malichev's archive. And this is a work by Marwan Rashmawi that we commissioned for the exhibition entitled Waste. So it's 4 sculptures made of various waste elements. Another theme that was important for us was that of cosmologies. So we're living a moment, evidenced not only by the current reintroduction of indigenous cosmologies into contemporary critical discourse, but also, as we see at Standing Rock, where there is much more at stake than the Dakota Access Pipeline. There's a clash between 2 ways of seeing the world, and our place in it. One that sees the earth as a resource given to humans to be exploited, and the other that sees as part of a complex system of living beings with rights to be respected. So in our interconnected world, flattened by the opening up of markets and the flow of capital, there's an ever more urgent need to think cosmologically, to build tools to help us think through and navigate these ever more complex entanglements. So we explored these ideas through the installation Forest Law, an important work by Ursula Beeman and Paulo Tavares. The installation, consisting of multiple video projection using various maps, text, and books, as well as 2 additional videos, explored the concept of the rights of nature, departing from the work of Michel Serres, his work on the rights of nature. And looking at the 2008 enshrinement of the rights of nature in the Ecuadorian constitution, a move that finally allowed many communities to bring oil and mining companies, as well as the state, to trial. We also had a reading room by Marwa Arsanios and Samir Fanjiye, which brought together literature on ecofeminism, political ecology, third worldism, and pan-Arabism as a toolkit to think through our current moment and to think of the legacy of failed movements such as pan-Arabism and what we might glean from these today. This reading room was activated also through several reading groups and discussions of the material. This is an image of a reading group we had with Dilar Dilek and Meral Çiçek, who are from the Kurdish Women's Movement in Rojava. So this is an extremely important political experiment that's happening very nearby, but which very few people have heard about. I'll just talk a little bit faster through things. So we saw the exhibition as part of a larger project, which included a series of 5 publications titled Elements for a World, edited by Berlin-based writer and curator Ashkan Sepavand, and an extensive public program for all ages. So the 5 publications featured newly commissioned essays and visual contribution, with each publication organized around a material reference: stones, sky, wood, and fire, water and fire, symbolizing the elemental building blocks of our world. With each element examining urgent ecological concerns from a local and global perspective. So here's just a quick summary of some of the themes and some of the contributors. So each publication was launched with 1 or 2 public programs, public events, discussions with contributors, or screenings in relation to the thematic. So the public program was really crucial in unpicking the ideas behind the works and the exhibition, but also in creating a space to learn both practical skills, but also discuss possible solutions to local ecological problems, and to learn and connect with grassroots initiatives. The public program brought together activists, scientists, civil society actors, architects, artists, filmmakers, and academics from Lebanon and elsewhere to exchange ideas. Here's an image of a talk by Adrian Lahoud under his installation, The Shape of the Eclipse, which looked at the notion of climate crimes. So his project tracked the movement of anthropogenic aerosol emissions from north to south, and the movement of humans from south to north. So these are emitted by industrial processes in the northern hemisphere and carried into the air by wind currents until they float high above the Atlantic Ocean. Aerosols interact with solar radiation and affect both ocean temperatures and the intensity of the wet season in the Sahel. One consequence of exacerbated water stress in the Sahel is the loss of arable land, something that intensifies existing conflicts and drives diasporic movements of people towards cities like Lagos and the shores of southern Europe. And at the same time, here's an image of a composting workshop by environmental engineer Ziad Abishakir, and a gardening workshop we did for children. So the public program was pitched at many levels, intending to open up the many facets of the exhibition, at the same time to create new encounters and affinities and enable new affinities to develop. So I've come to realize in the kind of year the museum has been open that many people first encounter the museum through its public program and then go on to kind of encounter the exhibitions. So unpicking ideas around citizenship and participation were an important part of some of these events. So what does it mean to be a citizen in light of global crises, and what does it mean on a local level, where there's no functioning government, no public policy, no social contract, and is citizenship even the right word to use anymore? So what is to be done? Many discussions or post-screening conversations, for example, turn to heated debates on how to tackle the current crisis of corruption and political stagnation. Here's another example of part of the public program. We programmed a series of toxic tours around Beirut. So these were a form of tour developed by environmental justice activists some time ago that take people to visit places that have become toxic sites to discuss possible strategies for intervention and remediation. So in Beirut, we worked with architect Adib Dada for a tour of the Beirut River, once an important geographic and cultural landmark, now a concrete bed flowing with raw sewage and chemical waste. The river is a contested site and a health hazard for local residents. We also worked with artist Jessica Khazri, who gave a tour of downtown Beirut and the former Normandy landfill. It was one of the images in the archive that I showed. Which was the main seaside landfill during the war, which is now prime real estate. So there's a real connection between kind of real estate and garbage in Lebanon. Artist Tony Shakar gave a tour of the Shuf, an area in Lebanon that saw much violence during the civil wars, a history that has been suppressed in post-war Lebanon. So using the format of a classic touristic tour of the mountains, he gave a performative tour of the area, using personal history to articulate how the landscape was simultaneously used as a space of refuge and a weapon of war during the bloody Shuf wars. In my presentation, I've really tried to show an example of kind of what might be a global program in a local context. But really, the idea of global and local, as we've really, been discussing today, I think are just really tools from which we can think, and maybe there's other more productive ways of vocalizing that. So thank you very much.